thank you so much to those of you who are here. Great to see you. My name is Sarah. I'm the program manager for the Growing Indigenous Storytellers Fellowship. So again, thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to be representing Journalists for Human Rights today. And want to thank our lovely partners on this program, so the Indigenous Journalists Association and APTN News. A little bit more on that in a second. That is, APTN News is what we're here to talk about today, which is very exciting. We're going to do between 25 and 30 minutes of presentation from Dan, and then we're going to do probably between 10 and 15 minutes of Q&A. This meeting is being recorded and the public part will be posted to YouTube, so please keep that in mind as you're asking questions and however you want to handle that. If you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable voicing, please feel free to drop them in the chat as we're going, and I can read them out in the Q&A period. Otherwise, you can just raise your hand when we get there. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dan David to speak to us today. Dan is Kanienkeha, so Mohawk and Bear Clan, and an award-winning journalist from Kanesatake territory near Oka, Quebec. He has supported journalism initiatives internationally and helped launch APTN, the world's first national Indigenous broadcaster. And that's what we're here to learn about today. So Dan, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Hello. Sago, which is Mohawk for hello, but I also like to throw in shalom, salam aleichem in case. Sawubona if you're Zulu just wandering around out there. I like to throw in things like that in their own language, because in my 40 years working in journalism, going all over the country, I've never heard an outside reporter come into our communities and use our own language to say hello or please or thank you. So I like to open up by just, using a whole bunch of different languages. Ni hao if you're Chinese, konnichiwa if you're Japanese. It's just good respect to be able to do something like that. Speak to somebody in their own language, no matter how little, and it just opens up all kinds of doors. Respect counts for something, counts for a lot. I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller by nature. I'm a storyteller by education and training. I'm a storyteller by profession as a journalist and a writer. And sometimes I call myself a genetically engineered shit disturber too. I think it's important to combine all that together if you're going to be a journalist in Canada at any time. My talk today is going to key on two particular things. One is their essential theme driving the development of Indigenous journalism in Canada today. Two, I want to dispel the notion that APTN News came out of nowhere. But first, a little bit about me. As Sarah mentioned, that I'm Kanienkeha, Mohawk. Born in Syracuse, New York State, raised at Kanesatake Mohawk territory in Montreal. That means something to me. My name is Dayo Ranyote, and when I was younger, I thought my mom said that it meant tall cornstalk or looking over the cornfields or something like that. My older sister is a Mohawk linguist, and so she rejigged the name, the spelling a little bit, and then she came up with a new meaning, embedded in the sky, Tayo Urunyote. So that's a great name, I think, for a journalist, just kind of overseeing everything. Another word I came across early on in my career is Gariwarorux. Gariwarorux means truth gatherer. Truth gatherer. And I've always thought it describes people in just about every Indigenous society. In West Africa, for instance, they call such people griot. It describes someone who is an historian, a storyteller, a praise singer, a poet, a musician. And instead of writing history, they tell stories. Stories sometimes passed down from generation to generation, to inform, to teach, to entertain. Stories about individuals or events in poetry or song, in saga or in legend, fables, fairy tales, stories that have a warning or a lesson, stories that may survive hundreds of years or longer. There are people who observe, bear witness, testify, faithfully relate stories about what happened somewhere else and bring them back to their communities and peoples at home. We might call them runners in the past in some of our societies here in North America. Oral historians, we call them today, but I think another word is journalist, a truth gatherer. I always felt that this is a better way to describe the role of Indigenous journalists, and I didn't need to accept Western journalism without question, means that I could understand how I adapt and use Western journalism standards and methods to kind of better fit my existing or our existing more traditional forms of Indigenous storytelling. I got a name for you that maybe you've never heard before, and it's Cook. Charles Angus Cook. Why should you know about him? Well, absolutely no reason. Charles Angus Cook was born in 1870, just about 3 years after Confederation, at a little place in southern Quebec called Ganassadog in Mohawk Territory, where I sit, where I've invited you today. He came into the world with the Indian Civilization Act, the first draft of the Indian Act that was designed at first to kind of remove people off the land, put them someplace called reserves so that other people could come in and take over their lands. The other thing was the other objective was to isolate Indigenous populations behind laws and policies and separate them from Euro-Canadians and settlements, because what they didn't know wouldn't bother them. I used to call it the buckskin curtain. The aim was to allow and encourage, help, and even push these so-called disappearing races to quietly move into extinction or assimilation. It was a long-term plan, a core objective of the Department of Indian Affairs, and I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know. Duncan Campbell Scott, a man who's rather infamous with the department, was Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs. And Charles Cook, that Mohawk that I mentioned, worked in the same office as Campbell Scott. We don't know if Cook supported or agreed with Campbell Scott's policies and decisions, such as the creation of Indigenous residential schools. We do know that Cook did things completely out of character with an unthinking cog in that bureaucracy. Cook created the department's first national library to collect and keep the bureaucracy's records and reports, memos and letters, everything coming out of the minister's office right down to the lowest Indian agent at some remote reserve. You know, edicts banning ceremonies and dancing to recorded deaths at residential schools. But Cook also made sure to collect and preserve letters, papers, petitions from lawyers, priests, ministers, and individual Indigenous peoples who were complaining about their treatment at the hands of the government, criticizing lack of food, applications for a pass to attend a funeral, petitions demanding that their rights be recognized. He kept all that stuff. He didn't have to, but he created that library, and I believe that my Mohawk self, anyways, hopes that he did so with the deliberate intent to preserve these documents as evidence of what one doctor at the time called a national crime. Now, why am I also bringing up his name? Charles Cook also wrote and designed and published Canada's first Indian newspaper in 1900, a newspaper that was all in the Mohawk language. The first edition of Onkwehoe appeared in 1900, like I say. The word Onkwehoe means the people in Mohawk. So Cook spent his own money to publish it. He hoped readers would subscribe or donate or pay for the printing costs, but apparently that didn't happen. He may have published 4 or more editions, we can't be sure, because only one copy of that first edition still exists at the National Archives in Ottawa. Maybe Cook was inspired by the Cherokee Advocate, the first ever Indigenous language newspaper in North America. Why mention any of this? It shows that there is a hope to tell and a hunger to hear our own stories. Another name, Edward Ahenakew. In 1926, Edward Ahenakew, a Cree in Saskatchewan, a minister, began producing the Cree Monthly Guide in Cree Syllabics. He published this collection of stories and accounts of events for 30 years until 1956. Like Charles Cook, we can only guess at the internal struggle that he must have he must have dealt with. On the one hand, he's a priest and he's likely expected to perform like other ministers and people of the cloth and encourage Canada's policies of assimilation. On the other hand, Ahenakew was producing his Cree Monthly Guide, which collected and preserved traditional ceremonies, cultural aspects, and the Cree language. It wasn't a one-off thing. It wasn't, a few issues. He published the guide for the Western Cree people for 3 decades. I've got an example I'll show you later of the front cover. Why bring them up at all? Well, because it's part of our journalistic history, part of our Indigenous journalistic history. These are only two examples, and there must be more, but I told Sarah that I just don't have time to write a book like this. Consider what's known in books and what's being taught in journalism schools right now, in high schools and communications courses. You got Pierre Burton, you got the history of the Globe and Mail, the development of the Canadian broadcasting system, the coverage of the Winnipeg riots in the 1920s, and so on and so forth. And these are important things that we should know and learn about. But we have a history as well that isn't known, isn't taught in journalism schools. In 1952, besides me being born, the Indian News newspaper becomes the first national publication serving Indigenous peoples, Indian and Inuit. It's published, weirdly enough, by the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa. Those first editions are full of smiling Indigenous peoples posing with Euro-Canadian bureaucrats and politicians, announcements of success stories, or so we're told. None of the articles are signed. The only names on the masthead are those of the minister and the deputy minister of Indian Affairs, until much later. And I'll tell you about that too. It's pure propaganda when it starts, but it lands on the desks of every band, council, Inuit hamlet, and Métis settlement office, nursing station, and Indigenous organization in Canada. It becomes the thing that creates a national myth, a comfortable narrative about government Indigenous relations. Like I say, all is well in front of this buckskin curtain. Everything looks fine, officially that is, but behind it there are people with a different story to tell. And they're about to begin tearing down that buckskin curtain in 1960 with the Bill of Rights. And finally, the lifting of a lot of laws and regulations that had kept them silent. In 1960, CBC Radio launches the Indian Magazine with Johnny Yesno as host. I remember listening to a story they did about an even then notorious Indian residential school at Fort Albany, something about an electric chair. Little known fact, a guy from here, a guy by the name of Jeff Gabriel, a relative of mine, a Mohawk from Ganezadage, is also a part-time host of that show. We keep popping up in the strangest places. In 1965, the Micmac News was created by Roy Gould. He starts publishing at first only to the communities on Cape Breton Island, and he keeps publishing. I don't know how he did it until 1991, nearly 30 years later. And by then, he's covering most of Mi'kmaq territory all across the Atlantic provinces. In 1969, three things happened at once, almost at once. Wounded Knee, the 1969 White Paper Policy, proposing the extinguishment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And the Akwesasne note starts covering a lot of these and other stories. The notes, it really is remarkable. It becomes an international newspaper covering the struggles of liberation by Indigenous peoples across South and Central America, but also environmental and political issues a lot closer to home as well. In 1972, Bernelda Wheeler takes over the Indian magazine on CBC Radio, moving it from Toronto to Winnipeg and changing its name to Our Native Land. Her voice becomes as familiar to listeners as that of Barbara Frum. Our Native Land becomes a must-listen program for government officials in Ottawa and elsewhere across the country, but also is listened to by Indigenous peoples across the country. A national program reaching out into every home. In 1975, the Native Perspective magazine is printed by Thunderbird Press at Manitou Community College at Lemacasa, Quebec. It's published by the National Association of Friendship Centers, and it becomes the first national Indigenous magazine in Canada. Some Mohawk, who won't be named, was the printer. Wawate News, meanwhile, expands its radio network, starts serving 33 communities in print and community radio right across northern Ontario, from Timmins in the east along Hudson's Bay down to the west Sioux Lookout, where it's headquartered. The James Bay Cree Communication Society does the same thing, establishing a network across 9 communities in central Quebec. NCI expands its radio network from the north and into southern Manitoba. The point is, that Indigenous journalism has a history of struggle with ups and downs that parallels the struggles and the ups and downs for recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada. The worse things get, the more important it becomes for Indigenous journalism to happen. We should know more about this past if we're going to understand where we are today politically and socially and where we're going tomorrow. But we don't. It isn't taught. PJ&P and me. The news 40 years ago was delivered by mostly male and pale people with university degrees. There were tons of blondes with lots of teeth and hair. My background was different. I didn't go straight from high school into college and then into a newsroom. I'd been a construction worker, tree cutter, ditch digger, garbage man, house painter, first outside, and then I moved to interior rooms, civil servant, a printer, one of those unnamed Mohawk printers, and a photographer. I didn't learn about life from books after high school. I learned it by working with Polish and Hungarian refugees, survivors of death squads from Central America, and veterans of foreign wars on construction crews. One winter, back home on holiday, I went to a party and bumped into a friend who was a friend of my older sister as well. He was married, had children, lived at Akwesasne, about 2 hours away. Anyways, we got to talking. He asked what I was doing, and I told him that at the time I was working at Indian Affairs and audiovisual. And I really, really hated my job. Even a coworker told me that I should quit before my brain turned into mush just like his. And I took that suggestion seriously. Anyways, my friend says, I always thought you were going to be a writer or a journalist. The next morning, I learned that on his way home, his car hit some black ice. His car slid off the road and overturned in a ditch, and he was dead. And those last words haunted me. They bothered me. It reminded me of a dream that I had put off, deferred to another time, maybe for too long. Not that much afterward, I heard about a 1-year intensive program in journalism for Native peoples, PJNP, at Western University in London, Southern Ontario. Like Bruce, I went there. like a couple of other people, I graduated in 1981, got a plane ticket to Whitehorse, Yukon, and became a professional journalist, my first professional job at CBC Radio. I was one of the few people, Indigenous peoples, that went into a mainstream newsroom. I loved it. I worked long hours. I learned a lot. But after a few months, I found myself still sleeping in the sleeping bag on the floor of my tiny apartment. My kitchen table was an upside down cardboard box. My only furniture was two lawn chairs that I, well, sort of liberated from somewhere, and I'm not saying where. Management treated me just like any other Northern Indian. So I didn't get the moving or Northern allowances that other people got. Southerners, you know, even though I was born in the States and probably a lot more Southern than they were, they got the living allowances and I didn't. I felt kind of mistreated. So I left that job, a job that I really loved. I loved radio and I loved working in the Yukon. But, things happen. So I spent the next year freelancing in Ottawa. Freelancing, if you don't know, is just another fancy word for being unemployed and broke most of the time. So this was in the early 1980s. Constitutional talks were going on. Again, that connection between communications and what's happening in the country. I got invited to a gathering in the back room of a restaurant in Ottawa. And there I came across people from Native communication societies, journalists from across the country, and they were sitting there plotting and planning their next move. Someone suggested they create a Native Canadian press, so that somebody in Halifax might do a story and send it to this office, this central office, and it would then send it back out to all the Native community radio stations and newspapers and magazines across the country. It was a great idea, except everything costs money, and usually stuff like this, it's just talk. You know, let's keep talking about stuff like this. But this time they actually did something. They created the National Aboriginal Communication Society, or NACS. And its job was to research policies and developments in communications, lobby the federal and provincial governments, chase grants and donations, and be that clearinghouse that they talked about for stories. Jeff Bear of Maliseet from Tobique, New Brunswick, was the executive director. I did some freelance work with NACS, but I also worked on a contract with the newly renamed Assembly of First Nations. At one point, I presented an intervention on behalf of the AFN to the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC. It was holding hearings about extending cable and satellite service to Northern Canada. Now, we knew that this would have a huge impact on Indigenous cultures and languages across the North. Just imagine the nightly news coming from Murder City, USA, on every TV screen in every Indigenous community across the North. Now, we saw the erosion almost right away with Indigenous languages. We also saw kids beginning to ape what they saw on television. Uh, we say just that if we were going to offset any of these impacts, let's do something. Let's take a quarter, maybe a half a cent from every subscriber fee paid to cable and satellite and put that into a fund that we could then use to support NACS and its work, but also to help Native communications in the wake of massive government funding cuts. The CRTC completely ignored us. I don't know why. Maybe if we had asked for maybe 25 cents or a dollar per subscriber, we might have got a little attention, but they ignored us. But the ideas were already there to create and fund national Native communications, whether in print, radio, or TV, and even magazines. It had to happen eventually. It was really just a question of when. Anyways, read around that time about an advertisement from CBC looking for journalists of color for something called the Visible Minorities Program. At the time, I could count the number of Indigenous peoples in mainstream newsrooms right across southern Canada on the fingers of one hand, and I could actually name them. There were more visible minorities mopping floors in every newsroom across Canada than there were journalists of color. I didn't know of any Indigenous person working in private or commercial, TV or radio, or magazines for that matter. If there were Indigenous journalists out there in the mainstream, they were at CBC Northern Service, but most were at Native community radio, newspapers, and magazines. And if I asked why not in the mainstream, most said, well, what's the use? If they got a job in the mainstream newsroom, they were dismissed as tokens. They just weren't smart enough. They weren't good enough. They only got the job because of the color of their skin. Or they were ignored because they couldn't possibly be trusted. They weren't objective because they were Cree or Silix or Mohawk or Mi'kmaq. Most didn't stay. They either jumped or were eased into a corner and left to vegetate. So the Visible Minorities Program at CBC was an attempt to kind of break down some of those barriers by jump-starting something, diversity hiring, to prove that dark people like me could be journalists, just like everyone else. More than 1,000 people applied to the VisMins program. The CBC whittled that down to about 20 or so, and they picked 7 people, 2 blacks, 3 Asian Canadians, 1 brown person, and 1 unnamed Mohawk. I like to tell people that we were expected to put the color into Canada's supper hour TV news programs. On our first day, in walks the head of TV journalism training. The first words out of Tim Knight were, "We are storytellers. We tell stories because they matter." And I thought to myself, finally. Those words meant something to me. We are storytellers. They didn't meant that I didn't need to be just a reporter anymore, rewriting copy from the news wires or press releases and pretending that this was journalism. More importantly, I was expected to actually be different. I wasn't expected to assimilate into the newsroom culture, to be just like everyone else. Up until then, I was expected to look like, talk like, walk like, dress like, be like, and even think like every other Euro-Canadian journalist in a room, only slightly browner. Now I was allowed to, and even expected to be me and to do journalism, to tell my stories my way. Because what I knew about news up to that point was that everyone seemed to be the same, like they'd come out of some massive journalist factory. They seemed to report the same story in the same way, using the same or similar language over and over, and it didn't matter which channel or newspaper, magazine, or radio station. I didn't want to be like them. I had a point of view, a different perspective, and a different story to tell. Even if we were covering the same story, I'd look for a different way of telling it. I had a voice and I wanted to use it. So for the next 20 years or so, Tim Knight, this self-appointed bishop or cardinal of his very own Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Focus, would be in my life as both a mentor, co-worker, co-conspirator, friend, and drinking buddy. And these were words that I used to describe him and his impact upon my life and my work. I wrote them the day after he died about a year and a half ago. There were others like him in Canada, other journalists he had trained, changing the way that CBC journalism was done. They shared similar ideals that truth matters, that telling it matters, that little else matters or isn't really journalism. And that passion was infectious, and I was infected in ways that I can barely understood. Even now, I'm still grappling with those ideas and what they meant to me, how they changed my life. Without those ideas, without that passion for journalism, I really doubt there would be an APTN News today or its still evolving style of journalism. At the very beginning of the APTN News, I brought in Tim Knight and his merry band of journalism missionaries because I wanted them to fill the heads of new generations of Indigenous journalists with all kinds of wonderful nonsense. That the powerful must be held to account for the past and present, that it didn't matter if it were them or us, that the truth will set you free, that seeking and telling the truth matters. We could be proud of telling the truth, even when we looked into the mirror and saw the deepest, darkest parts of our own people, our own communities and families. We needed to understand what the past had done to us if we were ever to understand our present. It mattered back then at the earliest days of APTN News, and I believe it still matters today. I always think about a quote that Thompson Highway, the Cree playwright, used to include in all of his playbills. You know, those little booklets that they hand out during praise that tells you all about who the actors are, blah, blah, blah. Well, he always had this saying by Lyle Longclaws, a Cree elder. We must first expose the poison before the healing can begin. We must first expose the poison before the healing can begin. I always thought that might be a fitting slogan for APTN News, printed out in big letters, posted up above the doorway so that everybody sees it every time they enter the building. The stories that are really worth telling, the stories that really matter, are stories that can change a mind, a life, and a community. Stories worth telling should try to change society for the better. Stories should remind us that we're all just human. Talking about APTN News, I tell people that at first I imagined APTN News through its programs to be a kitchen table. You know, we all have kitchen tables and we all sit around that table, at various times talking about things that really matter to us, personal things, deep things, intelligent things. We argue, we laugh. We're human. And so the concept for APTN News at first, my idea of APTN News is that it should be that kitchen table, that we could have people coming from the north and the east and the west, and we all sit around that table and we talk to each other about things that really matter to us, not to somebody else, but to us, to our people, to our communities, our families. The conversation will be funny or sad or really difficult to bring up in public, but I think it needs to be discussed. These things need to be brought out. It should be open, intelligent, honest talk. And as this happened, I would see people begin to gather around the kitchen table to listen in on our conversations, and they would be our Indigenous audiences. And after a while, we would notice that other people had come in from outside, Euro-Canadians, and they were leaning in, trying to hear what we were talking about, trying to understand, hoping to understand more about us, our hopes, our dreams, our nightmares, and everything. It was a concept, something that I brought back from teaching and training in the townships around Johannesburg, South Africa. It's something I learned from them, something they taught me, the importance of reaching out across the table. Indigenous national news. When I first got the job, I don't think that anybody expected a national Indigenous television news organization. I think what they expected at the time was what they had at the time, what they saw on other channels, a half-hour weekly program with the usual kinds of stories about fishing, hunting, dancing, and drumming, maybe an interview or two by the host. Maybe there might be one person sitting at a desk in a studio reading script after prepared script of news that they'd clipped from newspapers or found on the website somewhere. I didn't want that. I didn't want that at all. I couldn't see a national Indigenous news organization being that shallow, that bad. What I imagined was a gang of like-minded Indigenous journalists who didn't give a shit about the rules, who wanted only to go out and find truth and tell it. They'd be strung out all the way across the country, digging away at stories that might challenge all kinds of stereotypes and misconceptions, bringing the bad guys to account, correspondents, independent thinkers, setting their own schedules, exploring our own peoples and our own stories from Halifax to Vancouver, from Iqaluit to Whitehorse, and everywhere in between. So that was what I'd hoped. Not this model that everybody had of a weekly half hour. But of course, to make that happen, oh, that was the really hard part. That's where the hard work only just began. But the dream was that these journalists would actually do real news for a change instead of constantly softening their words and tone to make it more appealing or appeasing to a Euro-Canadian overseer. By the way, I use the term Euro-Canadian instead of white because I don't think that really fits. We didn't need an overseer anymore. We should not have anybody to tell us to tone down a story or to be able to kill a story because, somebody out there might take offense or not understand. We needed, of course, to develop our own code of journalistic standards and practices. Of course, we need to train our own editors and producers, but we would be in charge. We would decide what stories needed to be told and how to tell them. We didn't need to bow to the will of Indigenous politicians either. Because in the past, if you wanted federal funding, if you want to start up a newspaper or a community radio station, you had to include somebody who was, quote, a responsible individual. And that usually meant that government wanted a band or hamlet or settlement counselor or somebody from an organization sitting on your board overseeing everything to make sure that you were being a responsible journalist. The problem with that was that they couldn't sometimes, or often did, tell you what they wanted to see and hear or didn't want. And if you objected, if you bucked anything that they wanted, well, you couldn't and you were fired. So long, too bad, so sad. See you around. APTN News and its journalism then had to be free of those manipulations in order to have a free press of our own. It was something that we as Indigenous peoples needed for a long, long time, for too long a time. And now we've suddenly had it with APTN News. We then had to become confident enough to shoulder that tremendous responsibility. It would, and it did take time. We had bumps, a rough start, growing pains, but a foundation was laid, and it was something for successive generations of Indigenous journalists to build upon. How's it doing? You have to be the judge. Now, I began this talk with talking about 2 points. First, was there a central theme driving the development of Indigenous journalism in Canada all along? All those different stories, from Cook and Hennique and, the Indian news at Indian Affairs and all the rest of it. Yes, every development, every new initiative, every advancement was driven by one common objective, and that was change the narrative. change the dominant narrative, a narrative that fashioned us, shaped us, condemned us, Indigenous peoples, as perpetual victims of our own making or perennial problems that would not go away or be solved. Secondly, that APTN News came out of nowhere. With a snap of the fingers, it was created. Poof, there you are. No. APTN News is the result of decades of struggles by Indigenous journalists and writers to be free to express themselves, to tell stories without someone in some government authority controlling what they could and could not say or write or do. There will always be attempts to reverse that, to limit the freedom, to close that open window of opportunity. It's up to this generation of Indigenous journalists to find out what comes next and what they'll do about it. So I think I'm over my time, and I'll just leave it there. If you have any questions, concerns, shouts of bullshit, anybody want to throw a chair, please do.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was really wonderful. And yeah, like I went through a journalism education and learned exactly none of that. And it's a real shame. It's a real shame. Okay, so I think we're going to open it up to the floor. If anybody's got questions, please either raise your hand, or if you would prefer, I can read out your question if you drop it in the chat. Bruce is raising his hand.
Bullshit. No, I'm just kidding. Dan, I just want to publicly say thanks. I'm still here. I wouldn't be here right now if you and even Tim didn't see something there that brought you a sense of faith that something could be done. Although
What's your hair?
I probably blew every ounce of faith that you have in me, but I'm still here, and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. And I thank you for that very much. And if I knew how to say it in Mohawk, I would. Nanaskaman nitotem. Thank you very much, my friend. And I have to run, but it's been a great talk, and I'm going to look up that Edward Hennecue stuff. He was my dad knew him. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Have a good one. We'll see you again.
Before you go, Bruce, I just want to say, so Dan, we have you to thank for Bruce. Is that what's going on here?
That's it. That's right. That's the truth.
Awesome.
Or to blame.
The blame, yeah. All right, you guys have a good talk. I gotta get going.
Thanks, Bruce.
All right. Take care, Bruce.
Yep.
I have to run as well. I just want to say thanks, Dan. That was a great talk. Again, a chunk of history that I get little glimpses of over the years, listening to you talk and what have you, but never put exactly like that. Yeah, this really impassioned, buddy. I appreciate that. Working with APTN for 15 years, 16 years now that I have as well. I don't know. I kind of wish we maybe would have stuck to some of those earlier hopes that you had for what we could have been or what have you. I think we've kind of slowly fallen into that mold of, half an hour kind of, just feeding the beast and what have you. Anyway, I said there's still room to grow, I think.
All right.
Do appreciate your talk, though, Dan. Thank you so much.
Nice to hear from you. And I'm watching you.
Thanks, guys. I'll let you go.
Suzanne Bacon. Bonjour. Comment ça va?
Ça va bien, merci beaucoup. Moi, je suis à Espace autochtone de Radio-Canada maintenant.
Ouais.
Et il n'y a pas beaucoup de journalistes autochtones, francophones. Ça m'inspire beaucoup. I receive a lot of inspiration that, yes, we have to continue this battle in French, more in French also. Well, I have to share that, and you inspire me a lot right now. That's how I was shy to come. J'étais très gênée de venir.
Pourquoi? I'm a nice guy.
Ouais, j'avais besoin d'inspiration aujourd'hui. Beaucoup, beaucoup d'inspiration. Puis ça m'a fait vraiment du bien de t'entendre, Dan. Merci
Merci, très bien.
beaucoup, beaucoup.
Merci d'être venu. Pas content que vous êtes ici. Excellent. Okay.
She's a good friend of Bernie from Bersimus.
Excellent. And yeah, no, just to translate for not just the folks here, but maybe listening on YouTube later, Shushan, what she said was that there's not a lot of Francophone Indigenous journalists, and there's a lot of work to be done in that space to be bringing those stories in French as well.
Quebec. What?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very grateful for that perspective. Absolutely. Okay. Are there any other questions? Comments, thanks. I feel like it's been more thank yous than questions, and that's great. Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on to kind of the second half of this. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us. If you have any feedback, please feel free to send it to canadianprograms@jhr.ca, which I will drop in the chat now. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here and for sharing this information with us. I understand that you don't have the time to write that book, but like someone, I would read that book. I would read that book
Someone should.
all the time. So
I
putting that out to the
nominate you.
universe. Me? The last
Or you,
person.
or you, or you.
Yeah, like this is absolutely necessary. And yeah, just that. I'm really grateful to be learning this now. Wish I would have learned it earlier, but grateful to be learning it now.